He thought she was a shadow at sunset, until the shadow reached for his hand. What happens when a silent girl and a grieving rancher try to build a family the town refuses to see? The sun was sinking low when Thomas Hale first saw her sitting at the edge of the prairie road, her knees drawn to her chest, her hair falling in tangled ropes across her face. Dust clung to her dress, a thin, faded thing that hung loose on her narrow frame, and her bare feet were torn and raw from the stones of the trail. For a moment Thomas thought she was a shadow, some trick of the light stretching across the dry land, but then the shadow moved, and he saw that it was a girl, small and silent and still. He pulled his horse to a halt and leaned in the saddle, frowning as he studied her. She didn't flinch, didn't look up, just held tighter to the ragged bundle clutched against her chest, as if that scrap of cloth was the only thing keeping her from blowing away with the wind. He swung down from his horse slowly, boots sinking into the dust, and cleared his throat. His voice came rough from disuse, the kind of voice that did not waste words on things that didn't need saying. "You lost, miss?" he asked, though he already knew she was more than lost. She lifted her eyes for only a second, black as coal, then dropped them quick as if even that small glance had cost her something she could not afford. She did not answer. He tried again, softer this time. "You got a name?" Still nothing, only the faint rise and fall of her shoulders, and the way her hands clung to that cloth bundle, until her knuckles went white. Thomas studied her in the dimming light. She was not like the children he had known in town, not pale or freckled, not with the loose chatter they carried like dust in their mouths. This girl was different, her skin tinted with a hue the prairie sun had not made, her eyes shaped in a way that set her apart even without words. He felt a knot in his chest, not pity exactly, but something close to it, the kind of heaviness that comes when a man sees someone carrying a burden too big for their small frame. The wind picked up, tossing her hair across her face, and Thomas noticed her feet again, blistered and cracked from the long miles she must have walked. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. A man alone on the prairie could ride past and never look back, say it wasn't his place, wasn't his trouble, but Thomas found his boots moving closer all the same. He crouched down a few paces from her, resting his hands on his knees, his voice low. "I ain't here to hurt you. You hear me? You need food? Water?" Her eyes flicked up again, wary and shining with something between fear and exhaustion, and though her lips parted as if to speak, no sound came. Instead, she shook her head once, a small hard motion, and clutched the bundle tighter. Thomas let out a long breath. The prairie was wide and merciless, and a barefoot girl had no chance out here. Not without shoes, not without family, not without someone to guide her through the emptiness. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not just a stranger but a soul abandoned, left with nothing but silence. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Then you come on with me." He stood, held out his hand, and waited. At first she did not move, and he thought she would turn away, but at last she lifted her thin frame to her feet and placed her small hand in his, not out of trust, not out of hope, but out of something simpler, the will to survive another mile of the road. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, only the steady thud of the horse's hooves and the faint rattle of the saddle breaking the silence. The girl sat behind Thomas, her small hands gripping his coat, her face turned away as if afraid to look at the land rolling past. He had offered to let her ride in front, but she had shaken her head quickly, clutching that ragged bundle like it held her whole life inside it. When they reached the low fence line and the outline of his house came into view against the fading sky, Thomas felt her stiffen. It wasn't much to look at, just a weather-beaten ranch house with a porch leaning to one side and smoke curling faintly from the chimney. But it was shelter, and shelter was more than she had out on the open road. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brody, met them at the door with her apron dusted in flour and her mouth already pursed. She had worked for Thomas since his wife passed, keeping the place running with sharp words and a sharper eye, and she took one look at the girl and frowned deep enough to make her wrinkles fold twice over. "Lord above, what's this you've brought home now?" she muttered, her voice carrying the weight of disapproval that only a long-serving woman could muster. Thomas brushed past her without answering, guiding the girl inside. Word traveled fast on the prairie, faster than a horse could run, and by sundown Thomas knew his neighbors would already be talking. He could almost hear them now, standing on porches, voices low but cutting. The rancher's taken in some foreign stray, they'd say, black-haired and silent like a ghost. It wasn't the first time Thomas had gone against the grain of town whispers, but this was different. Folks out here did not take kindly to anything they did not understand. And this girl, barefoot and wordless, was something they would never try to. Inside the kitchen, the air was warm, with the smell of stew simmering on the stove. Thomas motioned for the girl to sit at the table, but she hesitated at the doorway, her bare toes curling against the wooden floorboards, as though she feared she was not meant to be here. He pulled out a chair, set a bowl in front of her, and ladled the thick stew until it nearly spilled over. She sat at last, her bundle set carefully in her lap, her dark eyes flicking between the bowl and his face, as if waiting for a command. "Eat," Thomas said simply. She lifted the spoon with small, uncertain fingers, her hand trembling as though she expected someone to strike her for daring to take food. When she tasted the first mouthful, her shoulders sagged with something that looked almost like relief, and she ate quickly but neatly, as though every bite was both a gift and a test she dared not fail. Thomas sat across from her, arms resting on the table, watching without speaking. Mrs. Brodie muttered again from the stove, shaking her head. "Bad luck, bringing strangers into a house. Worse when they don't even speak the tongue." But Thomas ignored her. He had seen enough in the girl's silence to know that luck had already turned its back on her long before this night. When the bowl was empty, she looked down, hands folded tight in her lap, waiting as though unsure if she should thank him or brace for scolding. Thomas reached across the table, took the bowl, and refilled it without a word. The faintest flicker passed across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite a tear, but something fragile in between. He did not press her for her story, did not demand her name again. He only let the quiet fill the room, a quiet that, for once, did not wound her. That night, as the prairie winds rose outside, the girl curled up by the hearth with the wool blanket Thomas set down, her bundle still pressed close to her chest. He stood for a long while by the doorway, the firelight painting shadows across the floor, listening to her soft breathing as she finally drifted into sleep. The house felt different with her in it, not noisier, not brighter, but changed all the same, as though something long hollowed had been given a new shape. For the first time in years, Thomas did not mind the sound of another soul under his roof. The next morning the prairie was still, the air cool enough that Thomas could see his breath as he stepped out to the barn. He worked in silence, his hands moving through the rhythm of chores, but his thoughts kept circling back to the girl. She had eaten without protest the night before, and had slept by the hearth like someone who had not known warmth in a long while. When he came back in, he found her awake already, sitting with her bundle clutched in her lap, watching the fire with eyes that seemed older than her years. She did not look at him when he crossed the room, but he noticed the way her bare feet curled against the cold boards, red and cracked and sore. Thomas stood for a moment by the door, then moved into the small storage chest by the wall. He pulled out an old pair of leather shoes, small ones, left behind long ago by his sister's child who had outgrown them. They were not new, not polished, but the leather was strong and the stitching sound. He set them quietly by the door, not making a show of it, not saying a word, and went about washing his hands at the basin. The girl noticed. He could see her glance flicker toward the shoes, then back to the fire, then to the shoes again. Her body remained still, but her eyes gave her away. She stared at them for a long while as though they were something far too precious to touch, something meant for another, not for her. Thomas didn't push her. He only hung his hat on the peg and poured himself coffee, letting the silence speak for both of them. Hours passed. She moved about the kitchen with careful steps, sweeping, carrying kindling, her bundle always close by. Each time she passed the door, her gaze snagged on the shoes, and each time she looked away quickly, as if afraid the gift might vanish if she claimed it too soon. Thomas said nothing. A man learned patience on the prairie, and he knew this was not about leather or laces, it was about something deeper, the first step of trust that could not be forced. By late afternoon, the light had grown soft and gold, spilling across the floorboards. The girl set her bundle down at last, moved slowly to the door, and crouched beside the shoes. Her hands trembled as she touched them, tracing the seams as though to be sure they were real. Then, after one long breath, she slipped her feet into them. They fit, not perfectly, but well enough. She stood, shifting her weight, her face unreadable, except for the faintest easing of her shoulders. Thomas, sitting at the table with his coffee, pretended not to notice, but inside his chest, something loosened, something he had not felt in years. That night, she curled by the hearth again, the shoes neatly placed beside her, her bundle still under her arm. Thomas lingered in the doorway, watching as her lips moved in the firelight. A single word slipped from her, soft, shaped in a tongue he did not know, and then she closed her eyes. He did not understand what she had said, but he understood the weight of it. It was not the word itself, but the way she spoke it, as if something inside her had finally been given rest. He pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders, then let the fire burn low, the quiet filling the room like a promise. The days slipped by in a rhythm both strange and steady. The girl rose early, always before Thomas, as though some habit of hardship had trained her body not to waste daylight. She carried water from the pump in a tin pail almost too heavy for her small arms, her steps cautious but determined. She gathered eggs from the coop, brushing the hens aside with gentle hands, never once flinching at the pecks that would have sent other children running. She swept the porch each morning, the soft rasp of the broom bristles marking the beginning of the day as sure as the sun climbing above the prairie grass. Thomas watched her with quiet interest, never telling her what she should or should not do, only noticing how quickly she seemed to know what work needed doing. She did not speak, not in words he understood, but her silence was not empty. It was a language of its own, carried in the way she moved, in the care she took with every task, in the way her eyes flicked toward him, as if waiting for approval or correction. He gave her none, only a steady nod now and then, and she seemed to accept that as enough. Still, he knew a home could not be built on silence alone. One evening he sat across from her at the kitchen table, the light of the lantern soft against the walls, and he pointed to the pitcher on the table. "Water," he said slowly, his voice deliberate, as though he were speaking to a skittish colt. She looked at him, then at the pitcher, her lips parting in hesitation. He repeated the word, "Water." Her brow furrowed, and she whispered it back, her voice quiet and careful, the sound shaped like a secret. "Wa-ter." He gave the faintest smile and nodded. She tried again, stronger this time. The sound still carried her accent, soft and foreign, but it was clear. Thomas poured her a cup, pushed it toward her, and she drank, her eyes never leaving his face as though trying to see if she had spoken it right. He only said, "Good." The next day he tried again, with bread. He set a piece on the table and touched it with his finger. "Bread." She echoed him, stumbling over the sound at first, then smoothing it out until it rang clear enough. He noticed the smallest flicker of pride cross her face. Gone as quickly as it came, but it was there. Every evening became a lesson. One word at a time, no more than that. He did not rush her, for he had learned the prairie taught patience better than any book. Sometimes she repeated the words back to him in a whisper when she thought he wasn't listening, testing them on her tongue like stones in her palm. And sometimes, when the work of the day was done and the silence stretched long, Thomas would hear her voice, soft and steady, saying again, water, bread, safe, as though reminding herself of the few anchors she now had in a world that had once given her none. By the end of that first week, she could string them together, haltingly but with certainty. She would hand him the pail and murmur, "Water safe," or place the loaf on the table and whisper, "Bread safe." It was not much, but to Thomas it was more than words. It was proof that she was beginning to trust the sound of her own voice again, and perhaps, slowly, to trust him too. Sunday came with the sound of bells drifting across the prairie, carried thin and clear through the morning air. Thomas had not set foot in the church for months, not since spring branding had kept him too busy, and then summer storms had kept him too tired. But now he saddled the horse and lifted the girl up before him. She wore the same faded dress, patched by Mrs. Brody's quick hands, and the shoes he had given her, which she polished each evening with a rag, as though they were treasures made of gold. She did not speak as they rode, only held the saddle horn tight, her dark hair whipping in the wind. When they reached the churchyard, the stairs began. Men leaned against the hitching posts, their talk falling silent, their eyes cutting sharp. Women held their children closer, whispering behind gloved hands. Thomas felt the weight of it but said nothing. He had lived with gossip all his life, and knew words lost their bite when you didn't rise to meet them. The girl stayed close to his side, her eyes down, her bundle clutched against her chest. Inside, the air was heavy, with candle smoke and hymnals. The preacher, a tall man with white hair and a voice that boomed like thunder, greeted Thomas with a polite nod, then looked at the girl with raised brows. "And who is this child?" he asked, his tone too loud for the quiet she carried. Every face in the pews turned to see her. The girl lowered her head, shrinking into herself, and when Thomas spoke gently, "Tell them your name," she only shook her head, eyes fixed on the floor. He tried again, softer. "Your name, girl." She gripped her bundle tighter, lips pressed shut, her silence heavy as stone. A murmur rolled through the pews, sharp and impatient. "She ain't got one," someone whispered. "Stray thing, brought in off the road. Don't belong here." The words pricked the air, buzzing like flies. The preacher folded his arms. "Every child has a name," he said, stern and expectant. Thomas felt the weight of their eyes, the pressure of their judgment pressing down. He thought of her bare feet in the dust, of the shoes at the door, of the careful way she learned each new word. He thought of her silence, not empty but full of wounds he could not see. At last he spoke. "Her name is Soo-jin." The room hushed. The word fell strange on his tongue, pulled from some memory of a sailor's tale he had once heard in a cattle camp, a name that sounded like it might belong to her dark eyes and quiet strength. The girl blinked at him, startled, then lifted her face to his. For a moment he thought she might protest, but instead she gave the faintest nod, a small bow of her head, as though she had been waiting for someone to give her back what had been taken. The preacher frowned, but wrote it in his book, and the congregation muttered, some disapproving, some curious. Thomas ignored them all. To him the matter was settled. She had a name now, and with a name came belonging. That evening back at the ranch, she sat by the hearth, her shoes neatly lined at her side, and whispered the sound of it to herself, careful and soft. Soo-jin. She repeated it again, almost like a prayer, until the fire burned low and sleep claimed her. Thomas heard her and let out a long breath he had not known he was holding. For the first time since he found her on the dusty road, she was no longer a stranger. She was Soo-jin. Rumors spread faster than prairie fire, and by the time a week had passed after the church service, the whole town had shaped stories around the girl. Some said she was a stowaway who had slipped from the hold of a ship in California, running until the desert spat her out. Others whispered she had wandered from the rail lines, where strange laborers laid track, left behind, or escaped from men who would not claim her. A few swore she was an omen, a shadow sent to bring misfortune to the Hale ranch. Each tale grew sharper the more it was told, and though none of them had truth, they all clung like burrs to her name. When Thomas brought her with him into town for supplies, eyes followed them down the street. Women on porches bent their heads together, voices lowered, but not low enough. "That's the one," they said. "The foreign stray." Children, bolder than their parents, called out names: ghost, girl, crow, girl, shadow, child. They laughed and darted behind barrels and wagons, not cruel out of malice, but cruel the way children often are, repeating what they hear until it turns sharp. Soo-jin kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her shoulders curled inward, her small hands gripping the hem of her dress until her knuckles whitened. She never cried, not in the street, not before them, but Thomas saw the way her steps faltered, the way her breath grew shallow like she was trying to make herself smaller with every step. He squared his shoulders against the stairs, his jaw set hard, and walked beside her as though the town's whispers were no heavier than dust. When a boy shouted ghost, girl, and tossed a pebble that skittered across the boardwalk near her feet, Thomas turned his head and glared until the boy fled. At the general store, Mr. Harlow cleared his throat too loudly, glancing between Thomas and the girl as though her very presence was something to be explained. "Need flour, salt, nails," Thomas said, his voice flat. Harlow nodded quick, bustling to gather the order, but his eyes kept straying to Soo-jin where she stood silent, hands folded, her face turned away from the other customers. A woman beside the counter sniffed sharply, muttering that she would not want her children near such a one. Soo-jin heard. Thomas saw it in the flicker of her lashes, the way she bit her lip, but she said nothing. Back at the ranch, when the chores were done and the house was quiet, she sat by the hearth with her shoes lined neatly beside her and stared into the flames. Thomas poured himself coffee and sat across from her, not speaking, just watching. At last she whispered, her voice barely more than breath, "Ghost, girl." The word was shaped clumsy but clear, learned from the cruel mouths of children. Thomas set his cup down hard enough to rattle the table. "No," he said, his voice firm, brooking no argument. "Soo-jin." She blinked, her eyes lifting to his, uncertain. He repeated it, slower, softer this time. "Soo-jin." She nodded once, then lowered her gaze again, but her shoulders eased a little, as though the word had pushed back against the weight of all the others. The rumors did not stop. Whispers never do. But Thomas carried himself with a steady, calm, unbending, as if her presence at his side was not a burden but a fact that no one could change. And though Soo-jin still swallowed her hurt and lowered her gaze, inside her a small spark began to stir, lit not by the kindness of the town but by the simple way he spoke her name, like it was the only truth worth holding. The summer light lingered long into the evening, spilling across the prairie and filling the house with a tired kind of gold. Supper was finished, the bowls scraped clean, and Thomas leaned back in his chair with the heaviness of a man who had worked sunup to sundown. He had not expected her to linger, but the girl moved quietly about the kitchen, her steps light, her dark hair falling over her face as she gathered the dishes. She did not hum or speak, only moved with a care that seemed more habit than thought, as though silence had long ago become her way of being. When the table was cleared, she slipped out into the yard, and Thomas thought she had gone to fetch water. But when he returned later, he found a single flower, a wild bloom with yellow petals, set carefully in the center of the table. He stood for a long moment, staring at it, surprised by the smallness of the gesture, surprised more by how it reached him. He had not had a flower in his house since his wife had died, and now here it was, not grand, not arranged in a vase, just a single bloom laid down by hands that had nothing else to give. He left it where it was, and the next evening another appeared, and the evening after that as well. He never asked her about it, and she never explained, but the house began to feel less empty, with those small splashes of color scattered across the rough wood. Her dress was wearing thin, the hem torn from days of work and wandering through the yard. Thomas noticed it one morning as she bent to gather eggs, the rip along the bottom catching his eye. That night, after she had gone to sleep by the hearth, he brought the dress to the table, lit the lantern, and set to mending it with needle and thread. His stitches were clumsy, uneven, his fingers too thick for the fine work, but he pushed on. The cloth puckered where he drew the thread too tight, sagged where he left it loose, but by the end, the hem was whole again. When she found it the next morning folded neatly on her blanket, her eyes widened just a little, then softened, and though she said nothing, he caught the smallest curve of her lips before she turned away. The days moved with a rhythm of work and quiet. She carried water, he hauled wood, she fed the hens, he checked the fences. Their words were few, but a language grew in the space between them, built of nods and glances, of the way she set his coffee on the table before he asked, of the way he slowed his steps so she could keep pace when they walked to the creek. It was not the bond of father and daughter, not yet, but it was not the distance of strangers either. It was something between, fragile but steady, as if they were both learning to belong without meaning to. At night, when the prairie winds rattled the windows and the coyotes cried in the distance, Thomas sat by the fire with his pipe unlit, simply watching the flames. She curled nearby with her bundle tucked under her chin, her breathing soft and even, and he found himself listening to it like a man listens to rain after a long drought. He had not asked for her, had not gone looking, but now that she was here the house no longer felt so hollow. He could not have explained it if pressed, but he knew it in the quiet of his bones. Somehow, without knowing how, they were becoming something to each other that neither had dared hope for. The first snow came early, drifting light across the prairie, soft enough that Thomas thought it would pass quick. But within days the sky turned heavy and gray, and the wind came howling down from the north. It buried the fields, sealed the barn, and left the house crouching against the storm, like a ship against waves. The fences disappeared beneath white, and the animals huddled close, their breaths rising in clouds that froze in the air. Thomas knew winters could be cruel, but this one struck hard and fast, catching him with stores too lean and firewood stacked too low. Soo-jin worked beside him, as the days stretched into nights that seemed endless. She carried wood from the shed, her small hands red and raw against the frozen bark, stumbling through drifts nearly as high as her waist. Each time she fell, she rose again without a word, her breath puffing white, her shoes stiff with ice. Thomas told her to rest, but she shook her head, and he let her, for he saw in her eyes the same stubbornness that kept him on his feet. Together they hauled what they could, fed the stock with what little grain remained, and closed the shutters tight against the storm. By the second week, the food grew scarce. Supper became thin broth stretched from the last of the beans, with only a crust of bread between them. Thomas shared it evenly, though his portion shrank more than hers, and she noticed but said nothing. Her silence was not weakness now, but a kind of strength, a way of carrying herself steady through hunger and cold. Yet Thomas could see the wear in her frame, the hollows deepening under her eyes, the way she pressed her lips tight against shivers. It was on the third morning, after another long night of wind and groaning timbers, that Thomas faltered. He rose from his chair to check the fire and stumbled, his knees giving way beneath him. The fever came quick, burning hot beneath skin gone pale, his breath ragged and shallow. He tried to wave her off, muttering that he was fine, but Soo-jin pushed him back with hands that trembled yet held firm. She dragged blankets over him, fed the fire until the chimney roared, and filled a pot with snow to melt. She moved through the hours like someone twice her size, keeping the fire alive, carrying broth to his lips, pressing cool cloths to his forehead. Her hands shook, her eyes wide with fear she did not let break through. And when she thought he was asleep, she knelt by the bed and whispered in the language of her homeland, soft strings of sound that Thomas could not understand. They were prayers, perhaps, or lullabies, or memories poured into the air, but the sound of them cut through the fever like cool water. For 2 days he drifted in and out, his world narrowed to the sound of her voice and the sight of her small figure moving about the room. She kept the hearth blazing, even when her arms could barely lift another log. She fed him spoonfuls of broth, waiting patiently until he swallowed. She whispered words he could not follow, but in them he heard a rhythm that steadied his heart. When at last the fever broke and Thomas woke to clearer air, he saw her curled on the floor beside the bed, her head resting against the blanket, fast asleep. The fire still glowed, the broth still simmered, and he realized it was her will that had kept him through the storm. Outside the blizzard still raged, but inside the small house there was warmth, built not only from wood and flame, but from the quiet, stubborn strength of the girl who had once been a stranger and was now something far more than that. The snow began to melt slow at first, trickling down from the roof in thin lines that froze again at night. Then, as the days stretched longer and the wind lost its bite, the prairie loosened its hold. Grass pressed green shoots through the thawing ground, the creek swelled and rushed with new life, and the ranch stirred back into motion. Thomas leaned against the fence one morning and watched the cattle spread across the field, their hides shaggy from winter. He felt the strength coming back into his bones, though his body was still marked from the fever that had nearly carried him off. Each time he rose from his chair and found Soo-jin by the hearth, with the fire already built, he remembered how close he had been to leaving the world, and how her hands had kept him tethered. She worked beside him as the season turned, no longer stumbling through the chores as she had when she first came, but moving with the rhythm of someone who had learned the land's demands. She hauled water with steady arms, gathered eggs with quiet confidence, and even helped patch the roof where winter storms had torn it. Her silence was different now, not as guarded as before. It seemed lighter somehow, like a cloak she had grown strong enough to lay aside when she chose. Thomas had continued his lessons through the winter, pointing to objects and saying the words slow, repeating them until her tongue shaped them without effort. She carried them in her memory like seeds tucked into soil, and now in spring those seeds began to break through. He heard her whispering them to herself as she worked. Water, bread, safe. Her voice still soft, but growing stronger each day. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the fields in copper light, Thomas sat on the porch with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. Soo-jin came to stand beside him, her hair loose from its braid, her shoes scuffed but sturdy on her feet. She looked out over the land with him, quiet as always, and then she turned her face toward his. Her lips parted, her brow furrowed with the effort of forming the words, and then they came, halting but clear. You live, I happy. The sound struck him harder than a blow. Simple words, broken in grammar, yet heavy with meaning he could not measure. He set his mug down with a trembling hand and looked at her, really looked, at the girl who had been a stranger in the dust, and who now stood before him not as a burden, but as a soul bound to his own. His throat closed too tight for speech. He could not answer, not with words. So he reached out and set his hand gently on her shoulder, the gesture steady but tender. She did not flinch, did not lower her gaze as she once had. Instead, she gave a small nod, her dark eyes holding his for a long moment, and then she turned back to the prairie, standing tall in the fading light. Thomas sat beside her in silence, the words she had spoken echoing in his chest, filling a place he had thought long dead. And though he did not speak them back, he carried them as surely as he carried his own breath, a reminder that sometimes the smallest sentence can break through the deepest silence. The evening had been calm, the kind of quiet that settles on the prairie when the sun sinks low and the air cools after a long day. Thomas was oiling the hinges on the barn door, and Soo-jin was gathering kindling near the porch. The light was soft, stretching shadows long across the dirt yard, when the sound of hooves broke the peace. 3 riders came from the west, their laughter loud, sharp as broken glass. Thomas straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, his jaw tightening. He knew the kind. Men who had too much whiskey and too little decency. They slowed as they reached the fence, their eyes landing on Soo-jin where she bent over the pile of wood. One of them spat into the dust and grinned. "So it's true," he drawled. "Hale's keeping a foreign stray." Another snickered and swung down from his saddle, swaggering across the yard. He looked Soo-jin over the way a man looks at an animal, not a person, and his lip curled. "Don't seem worth feeding. Can't even talk like decent folk." Soo-jin froze, her bundle of sticks slipping from her arms. The third man rode closer, leaned down, and spat at her feet. "Worthless," he hissed. "Ghost girl." The words, the tone, the laughter that followed, it pressed on her like all the whispers she had swallowed before, but louder, crueler, with the weight of fists behind them. Thomas moved then, his voice low but hard. "That's enough." The men laughed, circling closer. "Don't tell me you've grown soft, Hale," one sneered. "Sheltering strays, playing nursemaid, folks talk, you know." Thomas's hand went to the rifle propped by the barn. He lifted it smooth and steady, the barrel gleaming in the last of the light. His voice carried no tremor. "I said that's enough. Mount up and ride out, or you'll leave here on your backs." The men hesitated. They had expected silence, or maybe shame, not the cold steadiness in his eyes. For a moment the only sound was the creak of saddle leather and the distant call of a meadowlark. Then one of them spat again, this time into the dust between them. "You'll regret it, Hale," he muttered, swinging into his saddle. The others followed, throwing last looks of contempt at Soo-jin before wheeling their horses and riding off into the dim horizon, their laughter fading into the wind. Thomas lowered the rifle but did not put it away until the riders were nothing more than shadows on the ridge. Then he turned, his face still set, and saw Soo-jin standing by the porch, her shoulders trembling. She would not look at him, only bent to gather the sticks again, her hands clumsy, the wood falling from her grasp. That night, after the fire was lit and the dishes cleared, she sat curled by the hearth with her knees pulled tight to her chest. Thomas sat at the table, the rifle laid across his lap, the memory of their words still burning in his ears. It was then he heard her, soft at first, a broken sound that grew as she pressed her face into her hands. She was crying, not the sharp cry of fear but something deeper, something that carried the strange pain of being defended. She had never been stood for before, never been worth the risk of a rifle raised, and the weight of it broke her silence at last. Thomas looked toward her, his throat tight, but he did not speak. He let her tears fall in peace, knowing they were not weakness but release, the kind that comes when a heart begins to believe it is no longer alone. The days after the riders left carried a new weight. Thomas went about his work as steady as ever, mending fences, tending stock, hauling feed, but his thoughts turned often to the girl sitting quiet by the hearth. He had seen her cry for the first time, and though she tried to carry herself as if nothing had changed, he knew something had shifted inside her. She moved through the chores with the same quiet care, but her eyes lingered on him longer now, searching his face as though to be certain the defense she had seen that night had not been a dream. One evening, after the cattle were penned and the sky stretched wide with stars, Thomas went into the shed behind the barn. There, in the flicker of lamplight, he set to work with saw and knife. The wood was plain pine, rough and knotty, but his hands were patient. Each stroke smoothed a corner, each cut made the shape more whole. He was not a carpenter, not skilled in fine work, yet he worked with a kind of quiet purpose, as if each nail and notch carried more weight than it should. When the box was built, he set to carving, the knife moving slow as he traced letters into the lid. Soojin. He said the name under his breath as he carved. The sound steady, as though speaking it aloud, gave the work its truth. When it was finished, he carried it inside, setting it down by the fire, where she sat mending a tear in her sleeve. She looked up, her dark eyes wide, her small hands pausing in their stitching. Thomas cleared his throat, awkward now that the moment had come, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a ribbon, blue and faded from years, tucked away in a drawer, once meant for a child who had never lived to wear it. Beside it were the shoes she had first worn when she came, cleaned and polished, though their leather was still scuffed with the dust of the road. "This is your home now," Thomas said, his voice low but firm, the words carrying more than promise. They carried a claim, a truth he could no longer leave unspoken. Soo-jin stared into the chest, her breath caught in her throat. She touched the ribbon gently, lifted one shoe as if to be sure it was real. Then, slowly, she set her sewing aside and reached into her bundle. From its folds she drew a scrap of paper, creased and worn thin, the edges fraying. On it were letters not of his language but of hers, strokes dark and flowing. A piece of the past she had guarded, as though it were her last tether to the life she had lost. She placed it inside the chest with care, folding it once more before laying it beside the ribbon and shoes. Thomas watched her, his hands rough and still, and for the first time he saw her not as the silent stranger he had taken in, but as a soul claiming her place. She closed the lid softly, her fingers tracing her name carved into the wood, and when she looked at him there was no fear in her eyes, only something new, something that looked like belonging. The prairie does not stand still, and neither did their lives. The snow melted into rushing creeks, the grass grew tall and green, and the air filled with the hum of insects and the calls of meadowlarks. Summer came with its heat and dust, and then autumn painted the land with fire, before the cold winds returned again. Through it all Soo-jin changed, not in sudden leaps, but in steady steps that built upon one another, the way a seed pushes through soil, until one day it stands tall enough to cast shade. Thomas watched her grow in ways he had not thought possible. At first she traced letters by the fire, her brow furrowed, her lips moving as she sounded them out one by one. He had brought her a primer from the store, ignoring the stares when he laid down coins for a child's book. She struggled, but each night she pressed on, and slowly the words began to take shape. One evening she read a line aloud, halting and proud, and Thomas, who had lived most of his life in silence, felt his chest tighten at the sound. She had given voice to the world again, and with each page she turned, she claimed more of it for herself. When autumn came, Thomas set her on a horse, steady and patient, and showed her the reins. She gripped them too tight at first, her eyes wide with fear, but his voice was calm beside her, and the mare was gentle. Step by step she learned, until one morning she rode across the pasture on her own, her hair flying loose, her laughter carrying on the wind. It startled him, that laugh, so clear and unburdened, and he stood by the fence with his hat in his hand, listening as though it were the rarest sound he had ever heard. The house itself grew different. Where once it had been quiet and heavy, now it carried a warmth that reached every corner. She sang sometimes under her breath while sweeping, hummed soft tunes when she thought no one listened. She filled the table with flowers in jars, kept her chest near the hearth with her few treasures inside, and filled the air with a presence that made the place alive again. Thomas, once a solitary man, found himself softer too. He spoke more, smiled more, even laughed at small things. The lines of loneliness on his face eased, not erased, but gentled. The town still whispered, they always would. When Thomas brought her to market, some looked away, and others looked too long. But the sting of it dulled with time. They could not deny the bond between them, no matter what names they called her. She walked steady now, her shoes worn but strong, her words clear enough to answer when spoken to, her head no longer bowed in shame. She had been found without shoes, without family, without language. Now she carried a name carved into wood and into the life she had built, a name that meant she was never truly lost. She had only been waiting for someone to see her, to bring her home. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.